The haunted alley, where every step takes you back in time. Welcome to Ghastly Guide YouTube channel. You know how sometimes you take a wrong turn and end up somewhere that doesn't quite feel right? A place that seems to exist outside the normal flow of the world, where the shadows fall differently and the air tastes of old secrets. That's exactly what happened to me 6 months ago, and I'm still not entirely sure I ever made it back. My name is David Chun, and I'm a photographer specializing in urban decay and forgotten places. I've spent the better part of a decade documenting the hidden corners of cities, the spaces that progress left behind. Abandoned factories, derelict hospitals, crumbling theaters. These places speak to me in ways that the gleaming downtown districts never could. They hold stories, memories trapped in rust and dust. That's what brought me to Millfield, a former industrial town in Pennsylvania that had been slowly dying since the steel mills closed in the 1980s. The place was perfect for my work. Blocks of empty storefronts, houses slowly returning to nature, entire neighborhoods where the streetlights had stopped working years ago. It was a photographer's paradise, if you had an eye for beautiful decay. I'd been working there for 3 days, staying at a decrepit motel on the outskirts of town, when I discovered the alley. It was late afternoon on a gray October day, and I was making my way back to my car after photographing an abandoned department store. The streets in this part of town formed a confusing maze, and many of the street signs had either fallen down or been vandalized beyond recognition. That's when I saw it. A narrow passage between 2 brick buildings that I was certain hadn't been there when I'd walked past earlier. I'm methodical about my routes, always noting potential photographic opportunities, and I would have remembered an alley with such interesting architecture. The buildings on either side were different from the others in the area. Older, with brickwork that showed craftsmanship from an earlier era. The alley itself was maybe 20 feet wide and stretched back into shadow, disappearing around a curve perhaps 100 yards in. What caught my attention wasn't just the architecture, though it was the quality of light. While the street I stood on was bathed in the harsh glare of late afternoon sun, the alley existed in a kind of perpetual twilight, as if the shadows were deeper and more permanent than they should have been. I pulled out my camera and took a few shots of the entrance, but something strange happened with the exposures. Despite the dim lighting, my camera's meter was reading the scene as if it were much brighter, causing the photos come out severely underexposed. I adjusted my settings manually, but even then, the images looked wrong, flat and lifeless, as if the alley was somehow resistant to being captured. Intrigued, I decided to explore on foot. The moment I stepped past the threshold between street and alley, I felt a distinct change in temperature. The air was cooler, yes, but there was something else, a thickness to it, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. My footsteps echoed strangely off the brick walls, creating a hollow sound that seemed to bounce back from much farther away than a narrow space should have allowed. The buildings lining the alley were remarkable examples of late 19th century architecture, with elaborate cornices and decorative stonework that spoke of a time when even industrial structures were built with pride and artistry. But they were also wrong in subtle ways that I couldn't immediately identify. The windows were the right size and shape for the period, but their placement seemed somehow off, creating an asymmetrical facade that was visually unsettling. As I walked deeper into the alley, I began to notice other details that didn't quite fit. The bricks in the walls, while clearly old, showed no signs of the weathering and deterioration I would have expected. The mortar was clean and fresh-looking, as if the buildings had been constructed yesterday using century-old materials. Even stranger, there was no litter, no graffiti, none of the urban detritus that accumulates in forgotten spaces over time. About 50 yards in, I came to what appeared to be a small courtyard where the alley widened slightly. In the center stood an old-fashioned street lamp, the kind powered by gas rather than electricity. It wasn't lit, but the glass globe was intact and clean, and the metalwork showed the kind of ornate detailing that had gone out of fashion before my grandparents were born. I stopped to photograph the lamp, and that's when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, complete, absolute silence. No traffic noise from the street behind me, no distant sound of the city, not even the whisper of wind. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft click of my camera's shutter. That's also when I noticed the footprints in the dust around the lamp's base. They were clear and fresh, as if someone had been standing there just moments before my arrival. But the disturbing thing was their appearance. They looked like they'd been made by shoes from a much earlier era, with narrow heels and pointed toes that hadn't been fashionable for decades. I knelt down to examine the prints more closely, and something made me look up at the buildings surrounding the courtyard. In several of the windows, I could swear I saw movement, fleeting shadows that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. My rational mind insisted it was just tricks of light and perspective, but something deeper was sending urgent warnings that I was not alone in this place. I stood and continued down the alley, which curved gently to the right before opening into another straight section. Here, the buildings were different again, not just older, but somehow more primitive. The brickwork was cruder, the windows smaller and irregularly placed. It was as if I was walking backward through architectural history, each section of the alley representing an earlier period of construction. The silence continued to oppress me as I walked, broken only by my footsteps and occasional creak from the buildings around me. But gradually, I began to hear something else, a distant sound that might have been voices, or perhaps just the wind moving through unseen spaces. The sound seemed to be coming from ahead of me, from whatever lay beyond the next curve in the alley. I paused to check my camera's battery and memory card, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. According to my camera's internal clock, I had been in the alley for over an hour, but that was impossible. I had walked maybe 200 yards at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to take photographs. The journey should have taken no more than 10 or 15 minutes. I looked back the way I had come, expecting to see the entrance to the alley and the street beyond. But there was nothing but more alley stretching back into shadow, curving away into darkness as if it had always been there. The entrance through which I had entered was gone, replaced by what appeared to be another section of the same narrow passage. That's when the real fear began. Not the sharp spike of immediate danger, but the slow, creeping dread that comes from realizing you're in a situation that doesn't follow the normal rules of reality. I was lost in an alley that seemed to be longer than it should be, in a space that existed outside normal time, surrounded by buildings that shouldn't exist. I pulled out my cell phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. Worse, the time displayed was clearly wrong. It read 7:23 p.m., but the light in the alley remained the same perpetual twilight it had been when I first entered. If it really was evening, the alley should have been much darker. The voices I had been hearing grew slightly louder, and now I could make out words, though they seemed to be in a language I didn't recognize. Or perhaps it was English, but spoken with an accent and inflection so archaic that it might as well have been foreign. The sound was definitely coming from ahead of me, from whatever lay around the next bend. I had two choices: try to find my way back to a street that might no longer exist, or continue forward and hope the alley led somewhere that made sense. The photographer in me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown and mysterious, urged me to keep going. But every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around and run. In the end, curiosity won out over caution. It always does, doesn't it? That's how we end up in situations that will haunt us for the rest of our lives. I adjusted my camera settings for the strange lighting conditions and continued deeper into the alley that was taking me places I was beginning to suspect weren't just physical locations. The voices grew clearer with each step, and I began to realize they weren't speaking in a foreign language after all. They were speaking English, just English as it might have been spoken a very long time ago. As I rounded the curve, the voices became distinct enough that I could make out individual words. They were speaking English, but with a formal cadence and vocabulary of a much earlier era, perhaps the Victorian period, based on the phraseology I could discern. The speakers seemed to be discussing business matters, something about shipments and deliveries, but their words carried an undertone of urgency that suggested more was at stake than simple commerce. The alley had opened into another courtyard, larger than the first, with buildings that were clearly older still. The architecture here was distinctly colonial American, timber frame construction with white painted clapboard siding and multi-pane windows. Gas lamps lined the walls, and several of them were actually lit, casting a warm, flickering glow that created dancing shadows on the cobblestone ground. Cobblestones. The alley had been paved with modern asphalt when I'd entered it, But here the ground was covered with the kind of hand-laid stone that had been used in the 18th and early 19th centuries. I knelt to examine them more closely, running my fingers over surfaces worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic and wagon wheels. The voices were coming from one of the buildings, a 3-story structure that might have been a warehouse or meeting hall. Through the windows, I could see the warm glow of oil lamps and the shadows of moving figures. The building looked occupied, actively used, as if this were a thriving commercial district rather than an impossible alley in a dying industrial town. I crept closer to the building, staying in the shadows cast by the gas lamps. Through a window, I could see inside what appeared to be a meeting room. Perhaps 20 men sat around a long wooden table, all dressed in the formal attire of the early 1800s, high-collared shirts, waistcoats, and long coats. They were engaged in animated discussion, occasionally referring to documents spread across the table's surface. What I saw next made me question my sanity entirely. One of the men turned toward the window, and his face was clearly visible in the lamplight. I recognized him immediately from countless historical paintings and photographs. It was a face that every American schoolchild learns to identify. But that was impossible, because the man I was looking at had been dead for over 200 years. I stumbled backward from the window, my camera clutched to my chest, trying to process what I had just witnessed. It had to be some kind of historical reenactment, a living history demonstration being performed in this hidden part of Millfield. That was the only rational explanation. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, I knew it wasn't true. The building I had been looking into wasn't a museum or tourist attraction. It was real, occupied, active. As I backed away from the window, I bumped into something solid. I spun around to find myself face to face with a man dressed in the same period clothing I had observed through the window. He was tall and thin, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His eyes were dark and seemed to hold depths that were far older than his apparent age. "You seem to be lost, friend," he said, his voice carrying the same formal speech patterns I had heard from the building. "This is not a place for the uninitiated to wander." I tried to speak, but no words came out. The man smiled, though there was no warmth in the expression. "You have come far, haven't you?" he continued. "Farther than most who stumble upon our little thoroughfare. Tell me, what year do you think it is?" The question was so unexpected that I found my voice. 2024, I managed to whisper. The man's smile widened. "Yes, I imagine it would seem so from your perspective. But time is not quite so linear in this place as it is in your world. Here, the past persists alongside the present. Every moment that has ever occurred in this space continues to occur, layered one upon another like sediment in ancient stone." He gestured toward the building where the meeting was taking place. "These gentlemen, for instance, are conducting business that was concluded successfully over 2 centuries ago. But from their perspective, the negotiation is happening for the first time. They are unaware that their world has ended, that their concerns have become historical footnotes." I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen. The man continued speaking, his voice hypnotic in its measured cadence. "You see, this alley exists at a convergence point, a place where the normal flow of time becomes fluid. Each step you have taken has carried you not just through space, but through the accumulated years that have passed over this ground. You've been walking backward through history, witnessing echoes of what once was." "That's impossible," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. I had seen the evidence with my own eyes, the changing architecture, the shifting paving materials, the period-appropriate clothing and activities. "Is it?" the man asked. "You are a photographer, are you not? You understand better than most how images can capture moments and preserve them indefinitely. This place is like a vast photographic plate, exposed not to light but to time itself. Every moment leaves an impression, and under the right conditions, those impressions can be developed and viewed." He stepped closer, and I could smell something on his breath, not unpleasant, but strange, like old leather and dried herbs, the scent of a world that had vanished long before I was born. "The question now," he said, "is how far back you wish to travel. The alley continues deeper into the past, revealing layers of history that your modern world has forgotten. There are wonders there and terrors too. Knowledge that was lost when civilizations fell. Secrets that were buried with the men who carried them. Despite my fear, I felt a pull toward the darkness beyond the courtyard. My entire career had been built around documenting forgotten places. And here was the ultimate forgotten place. Not just abandoned, but somehow preserved outside the normal passage of time. The photographer in me wanted desperately to continue, to see what other impossible sights waited in the depths of this temporal anomaly. But I warn you, the man continued, as if reading my thoughts, the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to return. Time moves differently here, and those who venture too far into the past may find that their own present has moved beyond them. You could emerge to find that decades have passed in the world you know, or worse, that the path back is closed entirely. I looked around the courtyard, noting details I had missed in my initial shock. The cobblestones weren't just old. They were laid in patterns that predated any American construction techniques I knew of. The buildings, too, showed influences that seemed more European and colonial, as if this place drew its architecture from sources far older and more diverse than the American historical record suggested. "What is this place?" I asked. The man's expression grew thoughtful. "Many things, to many people. A crossroads, a repository, a prison for some. The indigenous people who lived here before the Europeans arrived called it the place where time stands still. They understood its nature better than those who came after, though they too were eventually drawn into its layers of accumulated history." He pointed toward the entrance to the next section of the alley, where the cobblestones gave way to something that looked like packed earth, and the buildings were little more than rough stone walls. "That way lies the deepest past," he said. "Centuries before your country existed, before the ships came from across the ocean. There are those who have made that journey and chosen never to return, finding in the ancient past a peace that the modern world cannot provide." I raised my camera and took a picture of the man, but when I looked at the image on the camera's display, it showed only an empty courtyard. He was there in front of me, solid and real, but somehow the camera couldn't capture his presence. "Photographs," he said with a sad smile, "are creatures of linear time. They cannot record what exists outside that stream. But your eyes can see, and your memory will preserve what you have witnessed, if you choose to carry it with you." The meeting in the building had ended, and figures were beginning to emerge onto the cobblestones. They moved with the purposeful stride of men conducting important business. But as they passed through the pools of gaslight, I could see that they were not entirely solid. There was a translucent quality to them, as if they were images projected onto the air rather than flesh and blood. "They are real," the man said, noticing my observation. "As real as you are in their own time. But they exist in a different layer of this place's temporal structure. You are seeing them across the boundaries of years, witnessing their moments through the filter of accumulated time." One of the figures passed close to me, and I could see his face clearly, weathered and serious, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. For just an instant, his eyes seemed to focus on me, and I saw a recognition there, as if he could somehow perceive me across the centuries that separated us. Then he was past, dissolving into the shadows at the edge of the courtyard like mist in the morning sun. "The barriers grow thinner the deeper you go," the man explained. "In the oldest sections, the past and present exist almost as one, but that proximity comes with dangers that you may not be prepared to face." He began walking toward the darker section of the alley, gesturing for me to follow. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I found myself walking beside him, drawn deeper into this impossible place where time itself had become just another dimension to explore. "Tell me," he said as we walked, "what do you know of your own family history? How far back can you trace your lineage?" The question seemed random, but something in his tone suggested it was anything but casual. "My great-grandfather came to America from China in 1902, I said. "Before that, I don't know much." The man nodded, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "Time has a way of calling its own," he said cryptically. "Perhaps your presence here is not as accidental as you believe." We were approaching the entrance to the oldest section of the alley, and I could see that the buildings here were constructed of rough stone and timber, with a primitive quality that spoke of a much earlier era. The air grew colder as we walked, and I could hear sounds in the distance. Not voices this time, but something wilder. The sound of animals, perhaps, or the wind through vast empty spaces. Last chance to turn back, the man said, pausing at the threshold. Beyond this point, the rules of your world no longer apply. Are you prepared to see what lies at the root of this place's power? I looked back the way we had come, but the familiar courtyards were no longer visible. The alley stretched behind us into darkness, with no sign of the modern world I had left behind. Whether I wanted to or not, I was committed to seeing this journey through to its end. I nodded, and together we stepped into the ancient past. The moment we crossed the threshold into the oldest section of the alley, the quality of reality itself seemed to shift. The air became thicker, more substantial, as if I was breathing liquid rather than gas. My footsteps, which had been echoing normally off the cobblestones, now made no sound at all, as though the very concept of sound was still being invented here. The buildings on either side were no longer recognizable as structures from any known architectural tradition. They were made of massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar, using techniques that spoke of knowledge far older than recorded history. The surfaces were covered with carved symbols that seemed to writhe and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, creating patterns that hurt my eyes and made my head spin. "This is where it began," the man said, his voice now carrying strange harmonics, as if he were speaking from inside a vast cavern. "Long before your people arrived, before any of the civilizations you know of existed, there were those who understood the true nature of time and space. They built this place as a kind of anchor, a fixed point around which the centuries could accumulate. The path beneath our feet was no longer cobblestone or paved earth, but something that looked like polished obsidian, dark and reflective as a black mirror. In its surface, I could see not my reflection, but glimpses of other times, brief flashes of people and events that flickered like images on a broken television screen. The indigenous peoples who came later knew to avoid this place," he continued. "They called it the hollow where yesterday lives, and they left offerings at its entrance but never ventured inside. They understood that some knowledge comes at a price too high to pay." I was beginning to feel disoriented, as if the normal relationship between my consciousness and my physical body was becoming unstuck. My hands looked strange to me, as if they belonged to someone else, and when I tried to check my camera, I found that my fingers were having trouble operating the familiar controls. "What's happening to me?" I asked, though my voice sounded distant and hollow. "You are experiencing temporal displacement," the man explained. "Your consciousness exists in your native time, but your physical form is adapting to the deep past. The deeper we go, the more pronounced this effect becomes. Eventually, if you go far enough, you may find that you have always been here, that your memories of the modern world are just dreams you once had." The buildings around us were growing taller and more imposing, their walls stretching up into a darkness that seemed to have no ceiling. The carved symbols were more prominent here, and I began to notice that they weren't just decorative. They seemed to be some kind of written language, though not one based on any alphabetic system I recognized. The symbols conveyed meaning directly to my consciousness, bypassing the normal process of reading and comprehension. And the meaning they conveyed was terrifying. They spoke of entities that existed outside time, being so ancient and vast that human consciousness could barely perceive their presence. They described rituals and ceremonies designed to attract the attention of these entities, to gain their favor or at least avoid their wrath. And they warned of the price that came with such knowledge, the gradual dissolution of individual identity, the slow merging with something far larger and more alien than human understanding could encompass. "You're beginning to see," the man said, noticing my growing distress. "This place was built by those who sought to transcend the limitations of linear existence. They succeeded, but perhaps not in the way they intended." We had come to what appeared to be the end of the alley, a massive stone wall that rose up into the darkness above. But as we approached, I could see that the wall was not solid. It was covered with doorways, dozens of them, each one leading to a different corridor that stretched away into shadow. "Each door leads to a different moment in time," the man explained. "Some to the distant past, others to possible futures. A few lead to times that never were, realities that might have existed if different choices had been made at crucial moments in history. The doors were all different. Some were simple stone arches, Others were elaborate bronze portals covered with intricate metalwork. A few were made of materials I couldn't identify, substances that seemed to shift and flow like liquid while maintaining solid form. Choose carefully, the man said. Some paths lead back to your world, but change in ways you may not expect. Others lead deeper into the maze of accumulated time, where you might witness the birth of civilizations or watch the last star burn out in the final moments of the universe. I approached one of the doors, a simple wooden frame that reminded me of the entrance to a farmhouse. Through it, I could see what looked like a pastoral scene from perhaps the 18th or 19th century. Rolling hills covered with crops, a small village in the distance, people working the fields under a warm summer sun. It looked peaceful, inviting, like a refuge from the growing strangeness of this place. But as I watched, I noticed something disturbing about the scene. The people in the fields were moving in perfect synchronization, as if they were all connected to a single controlling intelligence. They turned their heads at exactly the same moment, raised their tools with identical gestures, moved across the landscape with the mechanical precision of clockwork figures. That door leads to a time when the entities I mentioned earlier were more active in human affairs. The man said, "The people there are not entirely people anymore. They have become part of something larger, something that values order and efficiency over individual consciousness." I stepped away from that door and examined others through one bronze portal. I could see what looked like ancient Rome, but the architecture was wrong, too organic, too fluid, as if the buildings were grown rather than built. Through another, I glimpsed a vast library filled with books that wrote themselves, their pages turning without anyone to read them, accumulating knowledge that would never be shared or understood. How do I get back? I asked, though part of me was no longer certain I wanted to. The modern world seemed increasingly unreal to me now, like a story I had heard long ago but couldn't quite remember clearly. The man smiled, and for the first time, there was genuine warmth in the expression. "That depends on how much of yourself you're willing to lose," he said. "The path back to your time exists, but taking it means carrying with you the knowledge of what you've seen here, and that knowledge has a way of changing those who possess it." He gestured toward a door I hadn't noticed before, a modern steel frame that looked completely out of place among the ancient portals. Through it, I could see the familiar streets of Millfield, the decaying storefronts and abandoned buildings I had been photographing. "But once you step through," he continued, "you'll find that your relationship with time has been permanently altered. You'll see the layers of past and future that exist in every place. Hear the echoes of all the moments that have occurred in any given location. Some find this gift unbearable. They return here, eventually, seeking the peace of existing outside linear time entirely." I looked at the man more closely and realized what he was telling me. "You were like me once," I said. "You came here as a visitor and chose to stay." He nodded. "I was a historian, actually. Late 19th century. I came here following rumors of a place where the past could be directly observed rather than reconstructed from incomplete records. I found what I was looking for, but I also found something else. The understanding that time itself is just another kind of prison, and that there are forms of existence beyond the limitations of sequential moments." "How long have you been here?" "Time has no meaning in this place," he said. "I have been here for centuries and for moments. I have seen the rise and fall of empires, watched civilizations discover fire and build starships. But I have also experienced all of that as a single, eternal instant. The steel door leading back to my world flickered, as if it might not remain open much longer. I realized I had to make a choice, and quickly. "If I go back," I said, "will I see you again?" The man shook his head. "Not as I am now, but you may see me as I was. In the historical records, you'll find yourself drawn to research. You may even find that some of the photographs you take begin to capture more than they should, glimpses of the temporal layers that exist in every place, shadows of the past and future bleeding through into the present moment." I raised my camera and tried once more to photograph him, and this time the image appeared on the display. But it wasn't a figure standing before me. It was a man in Victorian dress, standing in a library filled with books, holding a piece of paper that looked like a research note. At the bottom of the image, somehow captured by the camera, despite being impossible, were words written in an elegant script. For those who seek to know, time is a river with many currents. Choose your course carefully. The steel door was definitely becoming less stable now, its edges beginning to blur and distort. I had perhaps moments to decide whether to return to my linear existence or remain in this place, where all moments existed simultaneously. One last question, I said. What happens to the people who choose to stay here permanently? The man's form began to fade, becoming translucent like the historical figures I had observed in the courtyard. We become part of the place itself, he said, his voice growing distant. Guardians of the accumulated moments, helping new visitors understand what they have found. It is not death, but it is not life as you understand it either. It is existence outside the constraints of sequential time. The door was closing, or perhaps I was moving away from it. I made my choice and ran toward the steel frame, diving through just as it collapsed into a point of light and vanished. I found myself lying on cracked asphalt in the familiar streets of Millfield, my camera clutched in my chest, the late afternoon sun casting normal shadows around me. But even as I struggled to my feet and tried to orient myself, I could feel that something fundamental had changed in my perception of reality. The alley was gone, but the knowledge of what I had experienced remained, burning in my consciousness like a brand. I stood on that cracked asphalt for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened to me. The rational part of my mind insisted it had all been some kind of hallucination. Perhaps I had fallen and hit my head, or maybe there had been some kind of gas leak from one of the abandoned buildings that had caused me to experience vivid delusions. But my camera told a different story. The photos I had taken were all there, but they were wrong in ways that made my hand shake as I scrolled through them. The images of the alley showed not the narrow passage I remembered, but a wide street lined with buildings from different architectural periods, as if every era of construction existed simultaneously in the same space. In some photos, I could see multiple layers of the same location, the modern abandoned storefronts superimposed over colonial buildings, which were themselves overlaid on structures that looked far more ancient than anything that should have existed in Pennsylvania. But it was the final photo that nearly made me drop the camera entirely. The image I had captured of the man in Victorian dress was there, exactly as I remembered it. But now I could see details that hadn't been visible on the camera's small display. The library behind him was filled with books whose titles I could read, and they were all works on temporal mechanics, paradox theory, and something called chronological archaeology. The research note in his hand was clearly visible now, and I could make out the handwritten text. Day 127 of my investigation. The alley continues to reveal new temporal layers with each exploration. I have documented evidence of at least 17 distinct historical periods existing simultaneously in the same physical space. The implications for our understanding of time and causality are staggering. I must go deeper. I must understand how this is possible. The note was signed with a name that made my blood run cold. D. Chun, Harvard University Department of History, 1887. D. Chun, my family name, from exactly the period when my great-great-grandfather would have been a young man. I had always been told he was a laborer who came to America to work on the railroads, but what if that was just a story? What if the truth was far stranger? I drove back to my motel in a daze, my mind reeling with implications I didn't want to accept. In my room, I spread out all my photos on the bed and began examining them systematically. The more I looked, the more anomalies I found. In the background of seemingly normal shots of abandoned buildings, I could see figures in period dress walking through scenes that shouldn't exist. Horses and carriages moved through streets that were supposed to be empty, and gas lamps glowed in windows of buildings that had been without power for decades. But the strangest thing was that I could see these details clearly with my naked eye now. It wasn't just the photos. My perception itself had been changed by whatever had happened to me in that impossible alley. When I looked out my motel window at the street beyond, I could see the layers of time stacked on top of each other like translucent film strips. The modern asphalt road was there, but so was the dirt path that had existed before it, and the game trail that had preceded human habitation entirely. I called my editor at Urban Decay magazine, trying to keep my voice steady as I described what I had found. But how do you explain temporal anomalies to someone who's never experienced them? How do you convince a rational person that you've discovered a place where time itself has become unstuck? David, Are you feeling all right? My editor asked after I'd stumbled through an increasingly incoherent description of my discoveries. You sound stressed. Maybe you should come back to the city. Take a break from this assignment. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to understand what had happened to me. And more importantly, I had to find out the truth about my family's connection to this place. That night, I drove to the local library, a small building that had somehow survived the economic collapse that had claimed most of Millfield's municipal services. The librarian, an elderly woman who had clearly lived in the town her entire life, was initially reluctant to help me research historical records. But when I mentioned the name D. Chun and the year 1887, her entire demeanor changed. "You're the one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wondered when you'd finally come." She led me to a section of the library I hadn't noticed before, a small room filled with documents and photographs that weren't part of the main collection. "These are the materials that families have donated over the years," she explained. "Things they didn't want to keep, but couldn't bring themselves to throw away. Local history that was too strange for the official records. What I found there destroyed any remaining doubt about what I had experienced. There were dozens of documents related to the Chun investigations, reports, photographs, and journal entries dating from 1887 to 1923, when they abruptly stopped. The papers told the story of a man who had discovered the temple anomaly in Millfield and spent decades trying to understand its nature and origins. The photographs were the most disturbing. They showed the same alley I had explored, but taken from within the temporal layers I had experienced. There were images of the colonial courtyard, the ancient stone buildings, and even some of the impossible doorways I had seen at the deepest level. But more than that, they showed the progression of D. Chen's investigation over the years. In the early photos, he appeared as a normal Victorian gentleman, dressed in the formal attire of his era and carrying the tools of historical research. But as the years progressed, something changed in his appearance. His face began to take on the same translucent quality I had observed in the man who had guided me through the alley. His eyes developed that strange depth that seemed to hold more years than any human lifetime could contain. The final photograph in the collection showed him standing at the threshold between the colonial courtyard and the ancient stone section of the alley. But he was no longer entirely solid. His form flickered between different ages, sometimes appearing as a young historian who had first discovered the temple anomaly, other times as an older man worn down by decades of impossible research. In his hand, he held a note addressed to my descendant. The librarian handed me a sealed envelope that had been stored with the photographs. "This came with the collection," she said. Instructions were that it should only be opened by someone with a family name who came asking about the alley. With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal and unfolded the paper inside. The handwriting was identical to what I had seen in the research notes. "If you are reading this, then the alley has called to you as it called to me. The temple convergence is not random. It draws those with the genetic markers necessary to perceive its true nature. We are connected, you and I, by more than blood. We are connected by our ability to see through time itself. I have learned that the alley is not just a passive accumulation of moments. It is a living thing in its way, feeding on the temporal energy of those who enter it. Each person who experiences its depths adds their perception of time to its growing consciousness. I have chosen to become part of this process rather than fight it, but you still have a choice. You can leave this place and return to your linear existence, though you will carry with you always the knowledge of what lies beneath the surface of normal time. Or you can stay and help guide others who will inevitably be drawn here. The alley is spreading, you see. Other sites are awakening as the temporal barriers thin. Soon, there will be pockets of unstuck time throughout the world. Whatever you choose, remember that time is not the rigid progression it appears to be. Every moment contains all other moments. Every choice branches into infinite possibilities. The alley simply makes this truth visible. Your ancestor and guide, D. Chun, I sat in that small library room for hours, processing what I had learned. My great-great-grandfather hadn't been a simple railroad worker. He had been a pioneering researcher into the nature of time itself, and his discoveries had led him to become something more than human. The man who had guided me through the alley hadn't been a stranger. He had been family. in a way that transcended normal generations. But the letter had mentioned something that filled me with dread. The alley was spreading. Other sights were awakening. As I left the library and walked through the streets of Millfield, I began to notice signs of temporal instability everywhere. In the windows of abandoned buildings, I caught glimpses of their past occupants going about their daily business. On empty lots, I could see the ghostly outlines of structures that had been demolished decades ago, still standing in their own temporal layer. The entire town was becoming like the alley, a place where past and present existed simultaneously, where the normal flow of time had become disrupted. And somehow, I had become sensitive to these distortions, able to see the layers of accumulated history that surrounded every location. Over the following weeks, I found myself unable to leave Millfield. Every time I tried to drive back to the city, I would find myself on roads that led deeper into the past rather than forward to my present life. My phone had stopped working entirely, the digital displays showing dates that range from decades in the past to centuries in the future, as if it was trying to connect to cell towers that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. But the strangest part was that I wasn't alone. Other people began arriving in Millfield, photographers, historians, archaeologists, and others who had been drawn by dreams or visions of the temporal anomaly. They all shared certain characteristics: a fascination with forgotten places, an intuitive understanding of historical progression, and most importantly, the genetic markers that allowed them to perceive the unstuck nature of time in this place. We formed an informal community of temporal refugees, people who had been changed by exposure to the alley and could no longer exist comfortably in the linear world. Some tried to document what they experienced, creating archives of impossible photographs and journals filled with observations that defied conventional understanding of reality. Others simply wandered the shifting streets of Millfield, watching the layers of history play out around them like living movies. As the months passed, I realized that I was following the same path my ancestor had taken. The boundaries between my individual consciousness and the accumulated temporal awareness of the place were beginning to blur. I could remember events I had never experienced, conversations I had never had, entire lifetimes lived by people who had walked these streets in decades past. And I began to understand that this wasn't a curse or a trap, it was evolution. Humanity was approaching a threshold where the rigid boundaries of sequential time would no longer be necessary or even possible to maintain. Places like the alley were preparing us for that transition, teaching selected individuals how to exist in a reality where all moments were equally present and accessible. The final entry in my journal, written 6 months after I first discovered the alley, reflected this understanding. Time is not a river flowing in one direction, as we have always believed. It is an ocean, vast and deep, where every drop contains a memory of every other drop that has ever existed. The alley showed me how to swim in these waters rather than be carried along by their current. Others will come, as I came, drawn by dreams and visions they don't understand. I will be here to guide them, as my ancestor guided me, helping them understand that what they have found is not an ending, but a beginning. A doorway into a form of existence where the limitations of linear time no longer apply. The old world is ending and a new one is being born. We are its midwives, the first generation to step outside the prison of sequential moments into the boundless freedom of eternal time. I sealed that journal in the library's special collection, along with my photographs and research notes, knowing that someday another descendant of D. Chen would find them and understand their meaning. Then I walked back to the alley, which now appeared on every street corner in Millfield for those who knew how to see it. The man who had been my guide was waiting there, but now I could see him clearly for what he truly was. Not just my ancestor, but myself, existing in a temporal loop that connected every member of our lineage across the centuries. We were all aspects of the same consciousness, experiencing different moments of the same eternal story. "Welcome home," he said, and his voice was my voice, spoken across the boundaries of linear time. As I stepped into the alley for the final time, I felt the last vestiges of my sequential existence dissolve into the vast, interconnected web of temporal awareness that surrounded this place. I became part of the guide system, ready to help the next visitor understand what they had discovered. Somewhere in the modern world, another photographer is having dreams about forgotten places and impossible architecture. Soon, they will find themselves on a wrong turn that leads to a narrow alley between two brick buildings. They will think they are exploring something new and mysterious, never realizing that they are actually coming home to a heritage that stretches back through generations of those who dare to see beyond the limitations of linear time. And I will be there to guide them, as I was guided, into the understanding that time itself is not what we thought it was, that every step we take moves us not just through space, but through the infinite possibilities of when and where and what might have been. The alley waits. It always waits. And it always calls its children home.